He needs to leave. This room is for people who belong in leadership. That's what the manager said, loud enough for everyone to hear, when the only black man in the room took his seat at the board table. No one stopped him. No one questioned it. Just a few awkward glances, some silence, and the sound of a chair being pulled back as the man quietly stood, holding the contract that would have made the company billions. They didn't care who he was. They cared only about who he wasn't. Wrong skin, wrong image, wrong assumption. But here's what they didn't know. The man they just humiliated didn't come to ask for a seat at the table. He came to buy the whole damn building. And before the day was over, every arrogant word they'd said would come back to bury them. This isn't fiction. This is what happens when the people you underestimate hold the real power and decide to stop being polite. Where are you watching from right now? What would you have done if this happened in front of you? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe in stories that expose injustice and flip the script, hit like, subscribe, and stay with us. Because this story isn't done. Not even close. The sun gleamed off the polished steel and glass facade of Calder and Knox Enterprises, one of the fastest rising tech companies on the East Coast. Their headquarters in Manhattan buzzed with morning activity. Executives rushing through revolving doors, assistants clutching coffee trays, sleek black town cars idling at the curb. Among them stepped Malcolm Reed, his stride calm, his posture flawless, his navy blue suit tailored to precision. He carried no entourage, no flashy accessories, just a slim briefcase in one hand and a phone in the other. The only thing louder than his silence was the quiet authority that walked with him. He paused at the reception desk, handing his credentials to the young security guard, whose eyes narrowed slightly as he took in Malcolm's appearance. "Morning," Malcolm said evenly. "I have a 9:30 with Jonathan Blake." The guard glanced at the badge, then at Malcolm, lips pursing. "I'll need to call upstairs," he muttered. "Have a seat over there." No offer of water. No checking the schedule. Just a vague, practiced brush-off. Malcolm said nothing, simply nodded and stepped aside. He chose a spot near the windows, where he could watch the elevators, watch who came and went. He watched 5 white men in suits get waved through without delay. One of them even slapped the security guard on the back like an old friend. Malcolm folded his hands. He was used to this, too used to this. But something about this morning felt heavier. Meanwhile, on the 23rd floor, Jonathan Blake sipped his espresso and adjusted his tie in the reflection of the wall-length window. "Who's that guy in the lobby?" he asked his assistant, Zoe, who was reviewing the printed agenda for today's pitch. She glanced down at her iPad. "Malcolm Reed. Reed Capital. He's here for the funding session." Jonathan's brow arched. "That's the guy." He let out a short, quiet laugh. "Doesn't exactly scream $2 billion, does he?" Zoe hesitated. "He comes highly recommended. BlackRock, Citadel, even Bain have worked with his firm." Jonathan waved her off. "Relax. Let's see how serious he is. If he's real, he won't mind waiting a few." He turned back toward the table where a dozen directors were settling in, his voice switching gears effortlessly. "Gentlemen, let's get started. Today's a big one." Downstairs, Malcolm checked his Rolex. 9:37. No word. No assistant. Just the same uncomfortable glance from the front desk. The guard seemed to shift in his seat more now, like he was aware that he'd misjudged something but didn't quite know what. Malcolm remained composed, still, patient. But his mind was moving. He recalled the first time he'd been underestimated, age 12, denied entry into a gifted science program because his parents couldn't verify his residency. He remembered every boardroom pitch where his credentials were questioned just a little too hard. Every passive-aggressive comment dressed as corporate curiosity. The elevator dinged. A young woman in a navy blouse and tight ponytail approached. "Mr. Reed? I'm so sorry about the delay. Mr. Blake will see you now." "Of course," Malcolm said, standing with quiet grace. "I appreciate you coming down." As they rode the elevator, the assistant fidgeted with her clipboard. "I think there was a scheduling issue upstairs, but it's all sorted now." "I understand," Malcolm replied, but his tone made it clear that he very much did. As the doors opened, Jonathan Blake looked up from the head of the conference table, half rising to greet him with the thin smile of someone who expected less. "Mr. Reed," he said, extending a hand. "Glad you could make it." Malcolm shook it briefly, then turned to face the room. "I appreciate the invitation." The directors offered quick nods, some distracted, some skeptical. Malcolm noted their posture, their eyes, their assumptions. He'd seen this dance before. "I've prepared a 10-minute presentation," he continued, "but I'm happy to take questions during or after, whichever you prefer." Jonathan gestured lazily. "Sure, go ahead." Malcolm set his briefcase down and pulled out a slim tablet. With a flick, the screen on the wall lit up. A clean, aggressive pitch deck appeared, full of sharp numbers, growth curves, strategic positioning. As he spoke, his voice never wavered. He outlined a 3-phase infusion plan, scalability benchmarks, geopolitical market leverage. Halfway through, the room began to shift. The eyes that had once been glazed over were now leaning in. One of the directors scribbled notes furiously. Another whispered to his neighbor. Jonathan stared, trying to hide the tightening in his jaw. When the pitch ended, there was a silence. Then a burst of clapping. "Light, but real. Impressive," one board member said. "What's your target close?" "End of next quarter," Malcolm answered, with terms matched to the projections on slide 12. "Aggressive, but doable," another muttered. Jonathan forced a smile. "Thanks, Mr. Reed. We'll review and circle back soon." Malcolm nodded. "I'll expect your call." And with that, he gathered his things and turned for the door. The air behind him was heavy, but the storm hadn't started yet. That would come soon. He gave a nod, concealing the rising tide of irritation beneath his composed demeanor, and followed her down a hallway lined with portraits of past company founders, each face white, male, smug in its legacy. She led him to a private space with floor-to-ceiling windows, minimalist furniture, and a coffee cart operated by a young man who offered him a latte he never asked for. Malcolm accepted it, took a seat, and watched the skyline while pretending not to notice the security camera angled toward the corner of the room, its blinking red light like a silent accusation. Upstairs, Jonathan Blake had wasted no time shifting the tone of the meeting. "All right," he said, closing the digital presentation Malcolm had left on the screen. "Let's get back to real business." The directors exchanged glances but said nothing. "We all know the numbers look good," Jonathan continued, pacing slowly. "But what I care about is who we're getting into bed with. And Reed? I don't know. Doesn't sit right." One director, a man with silver hair and tortoiseshell glasses, frowned. "The structure is solid. His fund has a strong record." Jonathan raised a brow. "Sure, but you can dress a resume however you want. The question is, do we trust him running around with that much stake in our future?" Another board member chuckled. "He doesn't look like a $2 billion guy." "No offense." "None taken," Jonathan replied dryly. "That's exactly the issue." 10 minutes later, Malcolm's phone buzzed. A simple message from Zoe. "Mr. Blake has requested to proceed without further input at this time. We'll keep you updated." He stared at the screen for several seconds, then slowly slid the phone onto the table. No invitation to return, no follow-up, just a dismissal wrapped in a carefully worded brush-off. Malcolm rose from a lounge chair, smoothed his jacket, and made his way back to the elevator. But instead of leaving, he rode it up 2 more floors to the operations level, where the company's strategic planning department was located. He had toured the space before during initial due diligence and remembered the glass-walled war room where key development meetings were held. As he stepped off the elevator, several employees turned to glance at him, their expressions neutral but curious. He moved purposefully toward the meeting room, nodding politely at assistants and analysts, until he reached the frosted door bearing the words "Executive Strategy, Session Private." Through the glass, he could see Jonathan at the head of a table, laughing. A digital projector displayed a roadmap marked post-investment growth phases, and next to it, bullet points Malcolm had submitted weeks earlier, rebranded, tweaked, and now being pitched as Jonathan's own vision. Malcolm didn't knock. He opened the door slowly, stepped inside, and every head turned. Jonathan's smile vanished. "Mr. Reed," he said, surprise and annoyance tightening his voice. "I thought you'd already left." Malcolm's voice was cool and controlled. "I wasn't aware the growth plan I developed was being discussed without me in the room." A few board members looked awkwardly between each other. Jonathan shrugged. "It's an internal review, Malcolm. Nothing formal." "Of a document I created," Malcolm said calmly, stepping closer to the table. "I'd like the opportunity to clarify a few of those projections. They're being misinterpreted." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, adopting the posture of feigned patience. "We're a little pressed for time, and this discussion is a bit above the level we initially brought you in for. It's best you let us handle it." The implication landed like a slap in the face. "Above my level?" Malcolm repeated. His tone was level, but his eyes had sharpened. "I brought a $2 billion opportunity into this room, and you're telling me to stay in the hallway like an intern." "This isn't personal," Jonathan replied, clearly uncomfortable now. "We just have procedures." "No," Malcolm said, his voice quieter but colder. "You have patterns." Silence hung thick for a moment before Jonathan cleared his throat. "Why don't we schedule a follow-up when we've aligned internally?" Malcolm didn't move. He let his gaze move across the faces at the table, most averted, one or two squirming. Then he nodded once. "Very well," he said. "I'll let you align, but I'll be doing some aligning of my own." He turned and walked out, leaving a stunned silence behind. As the door clicked shut, Jonathan exhaled and muttered, "He's not used to being told no." "Or maybe," said one of the quieter directors, "we're not used to being held accountable." It wasn't just business anymore, it was personal. He had seen dismissal before, endured disrespect in boardrooms, cloaked in pleasantries. But this was different. This was orchestrated exclusion, deliberate erasure. And Jonathan Blake wasn't even subtle about it. The next morning, Malcolm arrived at the office at 8 a.m., sharp, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that matched the storm building behind his eyes. He was calm, precise, and 5 steps ahead. He didn't go through the front desk this time. He had arranged a day pass from a director who'd quietly texted him after yesterday's incident with the words, "You deserve better. Don't let him bury this." Malcolm entered the elevator and rode up to the executive level, where the air was thick with polished arrogance and piped-in jazz. He stepped into the hallway just as the senior staff gathered for the morning strategy sync, an internal leadership huddle where investment matters were typically not discussed. Normally, outsiders were not welcome, but Malcolm wasn't an outsider. He was the reason this company had a future. He stood near the back of the room, silent, observing. Jonathan noticed him almost immediately. The flicker in his expression was quick but telling, displeasure veiled behind a professional smile. "Mr. Reed," Jonathan said loudly, drawing the room's attention. "Didn't know we were expecting guests this morning." Malcolm met his gaze evenly. "I'm here to follow up on the financial modeling discussion. Since it seems you're still using my framework, I thought it would be efficient to clarify things directly." Jonathan forced a chuckle, stepping into center view like a politician reclaiming the spotlight. "Appreciate the enthusiasm," he said smoothly. "But we brought in our own analysts to vet the proposal. Top guys. Been with us for years." He gestured toward a man sitting at the end of the table, tall, white 30-something, dressed in tech casual, but with a Rolex peeking out from under his sleeve. "This is Craig Porter, our VP of Finance." "Craig, why don't you walk Mr. Reed through how we're handling projections now?" Craig launched into a presentation riddled with misrepresented figures, clipped graphs, and casual references to restructuring Reed's assumptions. Malcolm didn't interrupt. Not at first. He listened, his jaw tightening slightly every time a slide misquoted his data or twisted his market research to support a lower valuation. Then came the moment that snapped the silence. Craig projected a slide labeled risk mitigation, investor influence management, and Jonathan, without missing a beat, added with a smirk, "This is where we make sure no single outside party can override our leadership model, especially those still getting their feet wet." The room chuckled but uneasily. Malcolm stepped forward, his voice cool but sharp. "Are you referring to me, Mr. Blake?" Jonathan's smile didn't waver. "We're just trying to protect the structure. You understand how it is. Big money doesn't mean big decision rights, not automatically." Malcolm took a breath. "So let me be clear. You're telling me that my capital, my network, and my strategic input are welcome, so long as I stay in the passenger seat." "That's not what I said," Jonathan replied smoothly. "But since you brought it up, we do have actual experts guiding this now." His gaze drifted toward Craig. "No offense." "None taken," Malcolm said, stepping fully into the room now. "But let's talk about expertise. Craig, how many successful exits have you overseen?" Craig hesitated, clearly unprepared. Two. "Private or public?" Malcolm asked. "Private." "Domestic only?" "Why, yes." "I see," Malcolm said, voice still even. "I've managed 7 public exits across 4 continents. I've weathered recessions, crypto crashes, and international trade disputes. I've sat at the table with people who make you look like interns. So if you're calling me inexperienced, you better have a stronger reason than what I look like in a suit." The room fell quiet. Jonathan opened his mouth, but Malcolm raised a hand. "No, let me finish. You've made it clear that what bothers you isn't my work. It's my presence. I've seen men like you my entire life, men who inherit power, but panic the moment they're asked to share it." Jonathan's face reddened. "Watch your tone, Reed." "Why?" Malcolm said, taking a step closer. "Afraid someone might finally speak to you without kissing your ring?" Someone at the table coughed, trying to hide a grin. Another looked away, uncomfortable. "If this is how you treat partners," Malcolm added, "I'd hate to see how you treat people who can't fight back." Everyone had arrived on time, dressed for optics, armed with tablets and talking points. At the center of it all, Jonathan Blake stood with his hands resting lightly on the head of the table, exuding a carefully rehearsed confidence. He greeted the directors with his usual blend of charm and command, but his eyes kept drifting to Malcolm, seated near the end, reviewing numbers like a man preparing to defend a kingdom. Tension buzzed beneath the polished surface. As the room settled, Jonathan tapped his mic and cleared his throat. "Before we begin," he said, casually flipping through a packet in front of him, "there's been a small change to the seating configuration." He didn't look at Malcolm when he said it. "Mr. Reed, I'll need to ask you to step out of the room for this session. We've decided to bring in someone with direct operational oversight to contribute today." The room fell quiet. Malcolm looked up slowly, brows drawn. "Excuse me." Jonathan finally met his gaze. "It's nothing personal," he said smoothly. "We simply want someone with deeper familiarity with our internal systems. You understand. We need to make room for people who meet the standard." His voice didn't raise, but his intent cut deep. One of the directors, an older man named Harold Bishop, shifted forward in his seat, clearing his throat. "Jonathan, I don't see why Mr. Reed can't be part of this. He's been involved from the beginning." His insights. Jonathan cut him off with a cool glance. "Don't let emotions cloud your judgment. This is business." A few heads turned sharply at that. Harold leaned back, visibly taken aback. Malcolm, meanwhile, remained composed. He closed the folder in front of him with precision and stood slowly, letting the silence hang. "You're making a mistake," he said, voice low but steady. Jonathan offered a thin smile. "That's not your call to make." Without another word, Malcolm gathered his notes, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the door. He didn't slam it. He didn't look back. But his silence said more than anger ever could. Jonathan Blake certainly carried himself that way as he sauntered into the members-only restaurant on the 45th floor, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny and shaking hands like a politician on the campaign trail. But beneath the surface, the cracks had begun to show. The directors, particularly the older ones, were quieter now, more measured in their responses. Whispers had already started to circulate, not just about Malcolm's abrupt ejection, but about the way it had been done. Still, Jonathan appeared unbothered as he slid into a leather booth beside 2 division heads and poured himself a glass of Cabernet. "Look," he said, Voice just low enough to imply confidence, just loud enough to demand attention. People can say what they want, but I don't have a problem with people of color. I'm not that guy. I've donated. I've hired. I mentor. But let's be honest, some environments just aren't the right fit. They don't teach leadership where he came from. It's not in the culture. There was a pause. One of the executives across from him blinked, unsure if he was supposed to agree or stay silent. Jonathan continued anyway, emboldened by the lack of pushback. This is a high-stakes board. It's not about social justice or appearances. It's about legacy, control. You don't put someone like Malcolm Reed at the top of that structure unless you want chaos. At the adjacent table, a young project manager named Daniel Torres sat frozen, his fork halfway to his mouth. He wasn't part of the inner circle yet, but he had been invited to lunch as a gesture of inclusion, one of the company's newer, shinier initiatives. What he heard now turned his stomach, and it wasn't just this comment. It was a pattern. Daniel had overheard Jonathan in private conversations before, usually after a few drinks, when the CEO dropped his polished mask and let the rot show. Like the time last quarter, when the company lost a lucrative bid after a negotiation led by a black female consultant. Jonathan had muttered to his CFO, "I'd rather lose the contract than kiss the ring of someone who thinks success is an entitlement." Daniel hadn't spoken up then, unsure of how to navigate the power imbalance, afraid of losing his footing. But today felt different. Today, there were witnesses. Today, people had seen what Jonathan had done to Malcolm, and now the poison was spilling into daylight. Later that afternoon, Daniel made his way back to the office, the unease still clinging to him. He wasn't close with Malcolm, had only seen him in passing, but the injustice was unmistakable. He passed Zoe in the hallway, Jonathan's assistant, and paused. "Hey," he said, his voice hushed. "Did you hear what Blake said over lunch?" Zoe glanced around and nodded subtly. "I did, and I heard worse yesterday." Daniel hesitated, then leaned in. "Why does no one say anything?" Zoe's eyes hardened. "Because they're afraid. Because he's built an empire of fear and charm. And most people can't afford to be on the wrong side of it." "Maybe they don't have to," Daniel said, voice steadier now. "Maybe it just takes one person to speak." Zoe looked at him for a long second, then turned and walked away. But later that night, Daniel opened his laptop and drafted a memo, coded factual, but damning, outlining patterns of discriminatory behavior witnessed over several quarters, complete with quotes and names. He saved it to a flash drive, unsigned, and dropped it anonymously into the legal department's ethics inbox. But while most of the staff moved quietly, cautiously navigating the brewing storm, Jonathan doubled down. Power was still in his hands, and as far as he was concerned, perception was reality. The board still answered to him. HR was still on his payroll. Malcolm Reed was still, at least in his mind, just an interested party without real control. So when Jonathan summoned IT to clean the architecture of their document repository, he cloaked the order in vague language about security, redundancies, and server optimization. No one questioned it. No one challenged him. But the next morning, Malcolm did. Sitting in his private office across the city, Malcolm opened the Calder investor portal to review his stake position, only to find a red error banner flashing at the top. Access denied. Account not found. His fingers froze. He refreshed the page. Same result. He tried a direct document link from a saved email. 404 not found. He logged into the due diligence dashboard that held his signed term sheets, analytics models, and engagement contracts. Empty. Clean slate. As if he had never existed in the system. For a few seconds, Malcolm just stared at the screen, absorbing the weight of what it meant. He knew what this was. It wasn't a glitch. It wasn't an accident. It was erasure. A targeted, deliberate digital purge. And only one man had both the motive and the authority to authorize it. Jonathan Blake had just made his boldest move yet, an attempt to delete Malcolm's very presence from the foundation of Calder and Knox's growth strategy. But what Jonathan didn't know was that Malcolm had backups, local, time-stamped, legally notarized, and encrypted in cold storage. Still, that wasn't the point. The point was that this act wasn't about legality. It was about signaling dominance, about telling the world, he's gone, and I made it so. Later that same afternoon, Jonathan walked into the company's town hall meeting like a man crowned king. The room was packed with mid-level staff, department heads, interns, and analysts, all pretending to be present while scrolling news apps on their phones. Jonathan stepped onto the stage, mic in hand, smile perfectly measured. "Thanks for being here, everyone," he said. "Today, I want to talk about the future." For 20 minutes, he rambled through inflated projections, vague innovation promises, and empty corporate jargon. But then came a line, the one no one expected him to say aloud. "As some of you may have heard," he said, casually straightening his sleeve, "we've had some delays with a potential funding partner. That's unfortunate, but not irreversible. We'll find someone else. Someone a little more aligned with our vision. Perhaps someone." Fu-ha-pun. The room shifted. The silence was instant and icy. Fu-ha-pun. The phrase carried the weight of everything left unsaid, of race, of power, of exclusion. Even the junior staffers in the back stopped pretending to be distracted. Everyone heard it. Everyone felt it. Malcolm's name wasn't mentioned, but it didn't need to be. The message was clear. The man who had brought them their golden opportunity had been cast aside, and the justification, thinly veiled as alignment, was insult laid atop injury. At that exact moment, Malcolm watched the live stream from his office, expression blank. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He simply closed the laptop and picked up his phone. "Activate the alternate option," he said calmly into the receiver. "It's time." Across town, his legal team, already briefed and prepared, began unsealing documents. The press embargo timer started ticking. Calls were made to 3 rival venture firms that had been circling Calder's assets for months. The media had caught wind of a mysterious investor withdrawal, and the company's stock had begun to dip, not dramatically, but enough to trigger nervous calls from private equity partners. Jonathan, as always, insisted everything was under control. The meeting room was sleek, sterile, and overly lit, its air thick with the artificial calm of corporate spin. At the center stood Jonathan, again commanding the floor, again deflecting questions with manufactured ease. "Our previous investor," he began, deliberately avoiding Malcolm's name, "has stepped away. But we have alternatives, stronger ones, in fact. I'm already in talks with new partners more aligned with our long-term vision." Several board members nodded absently, though a few eyes narrowed. Just as Jonathan prepared to unveil a pitch deck for a new strategic partnership, the conference room doors opened with a soft but deliberate click. Every head turned. Malcolm Reed stepped inside, composed as ever, wearing a dark tailored suit and holding a black leather portfolio that radiated finality. His entrance wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The silence that followed was deafening. "Apologies for the interruption," Malcolm said evenly, his voice carrying not just authority, but inevitability. "But I believe this session concerns my capital, my strategy, and my name, and I intend to reclaim all 3. Jonathan blinked, frozen mid-sentence. "You no longer have standing here," he said stiffly. "This is a closed executive session." "Correction," Malcolm interjected. "It's now a legal review session, and I'm here under authority granted to me by my controlling stake in Reed Capital." He stepped forward, placing a thick folder on the table. "I suggest you read the acquisition proposal before you say another word." The lead legal counsel, seated at the far end, leaned forward and flipped open the first page. His face visibly paled. The header read, "Reed Capital Acquisition Plan Calder and Knox Executive Management Buyout." One of the directors gasped. Another whispered, "Wait, acquisition?" Malcolm didn't wait for them to catch up. He slid a second document forward. "This is my certification as CEO and majority shareholder of Reed Capital Partners. And this," he held up a signed copy with multiple stamps, "is the final offer, accepted by the majority of silent stakeholders and institutional backers who had been kept in the dark about recent internal misconduct." Jonathan's mouth parted slightly, but no words came out. His hands tightened into fists at his sides. "You manipulated the system," he said finally, voice low. You blindsided us. Malcolm raised an eyebrow. I gave you every chance to treat me as a partner. You chose to treat me as a threat. So I became one. The room was still frozen, but the mood had changed. It was no longer Jonathan's room. It was Malcolm's. I didn't come here to fight, Malcolm continued. I came here to invest in something I believed had potential. But when I saw how that potential was being suppressed by arrogance and discrimination, I made another decision. He turned slightly, addressing the full table. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to restructure. Then came the final blow. Effective today, Reed Capital will assume controlling interest in Calder and Knox's governance. The current executive leadership team will be reviewed for compliance and, pending approval, may be replaced. That includes the CEO. A stunned hush followed. Jonathan stepped forward, voice sharp. You can't do this. You don't have the board. Malcolm smiled faintly. You didn't read the fine print, Jonathan. I don't need the board. I bought the people who own the board. The lead counsel stood slowly, face pale, eyes scanning the legal brief. It's legitimate, he said softly. He's within his rights. Jonathan staggered back a half step, as if the words had physically struck him. This is my company, he growled. Malcolm's voice dropped to a near whisper, every syllable deliberate. It was. Now it's mine. Then he straightened, eyes sweeping the room. Jonathan Blake remained standing near the edge of the table, his pride battered, his breath uneven as he watched everything he had built, his illusion of control, being peeled away with surgical precision. Malcolm adjusted the cuffs of his suit and spoke clearly, each word deliberate and piercing. Let me be absolutely clear, he said. Reed Capital will not proceed with any investment under the current structural conditions. Effective immediately, we are withdrawing all financial involvement. The room shifted. A murmur began among the directors, one that quickly spiraled into confusion and disbelief. What? One board member blurted out. But didn't you say? Malcolm raised a hand, silencing the noise. Yes, I came here to invest. I came here to help grow something meaningful. But what I found instead is a culture steeped in arrogance, systemic bias, and leadership that mistakes power for immunity. He turned his gaze to Jonathan. You don't build legacy by silencing the voices that challenge you. You build it by confronting what's broken and rebuilding from truth. This company doesn't need my money. It needs reckoning. Jonathan took a step forward, face flushed with disbelief. You can't walk away. Not like this. You'll destroy everything. Malcolm's tone was ice. No, Jonathan. You destroyed it. I'm just exposing it. Just then, Zoe, Jonathan's assistant, entered the room cautiously, a phone in hand and a look of controlled panic on her face. She walked straight to the lead counsel and whispered something in his ear. His brows furrowed, and he turned pale. What is it? Jonathan demanded. Zoe looked straight at him, her voice tight. There's a video circulating online. It's from a lunch meeting 3 days ago. Your conversation about cultural leadership, the one where you said, she hesitated, but the silence demanded completion. People like Malcolm don't belong in leadership environments. Gasps echoed around the room. Malcolm said nothing. He didn't need to. The truth had finally spoken for itself. Zoe continued. The clip is going viral. It's been viewed over 3 million times in the last 4 hours. It's already trending across every platform with the hashtag #CalderCollapse. Jonathan's jaw went slack, and he stumbled backward into a chair. The lead legal counsel added, Our compliance line is lighting up. Investors are calling, and media outlets want an official response. This is a reputational catastrophe. Malcolm remained calm, centered, unmoved by the chaos he had predicted, and in many ways allowed to unfold. I gave you every chance, he said to the room. I stayed silent when you whispered. I stepped back when you tried to erase me. I waited, thinking maybe the institution could correct itself. But today proved it can't. So now the correction will come from outside. One of the younger board members finally spoke. What happens next? Malcolm turned toward the exit, his voice steady. What happens next is yours to decide. but you'll be doing it without my capital, and without the protections that came with it." With that, he walked out, leaving the boardroom steeped in the echoes of what had just occurred. The moment the door closed behind him, the phones in the room began buzzing in unison. Notifications, headlines, market alerts. One screen on the far wall blinked red. CKX down 17.3% in pre-market trading. The company that had once projected invincibility was crumbling in real time. Jonathan sat motionless, his face pale, his hands clasped in front of him as if in prayer. The screens around him no longer displayed optimistic forecasts or congratulatory slideshows. Instead, they streamed a loop of breaking news reports, financial commentators analyzing the company's collapse, and social media feeds flooded with outrage. The viral video had broken more than just his reputation. It had cracked the foundation of Calder and Knox's identity. Shareholders were furious. Advocacy groups were staging boycotts. A class action discrimination lawsuit was already being drafted. The silence around Jonathan wasn't the kind that offered peace. It was the kind that suffocates. That morning, the board had reconvened without fanfare, no catered breakfast, no small talk. The mood was as bleak as the numbers. Stock value had plummeted another 14% overnight. Key accounts had begun to suspend payments. Internal chats leaked. Morale had shattered. The first to speak was Harold Bishop, once a cautious supporter of Jonathan's leadership. "We've reviewed legal counsel's recommendation," he said, his voice grim but resolute. "And in the interest of preserving what little goodwill we have left, this board unanimously moves to remove you from the position of Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately." Jonathan didn't fight it. He couldn't. The room already smelled like death, and everyone knew where the body was buried. His chair creaked as he stood. "You think this'll fix it?" he asked, voice hoarse. "You think tossing me out buys you redemption?" No one answered. They didn't need to. The board members, who once vied for his approval, now only wanted distance from his name. "You'll be stripped of all executive privileges and equity vestments pending an internal audit," Harold continued. "We're initiating emergency restructuring and issuing a formal apology. It won't be enough, but it's what we have." One by one, directors began placing their resignation letters onto the table. Some typed, some handwritten, each a quiet admission of complicity. By the end of the hour, over half the board had stepped down. The message was clear: survival required sacrifice, and Jonathan had just become the first offering. But the reckoning didn't stop at the top. Later that day, Calder and Knox's flagship partners, Brightmore Logistics, Orion Cloud Services, and Blue Cap Technologies, issued synchronized press releases declaring their withdrawal from all current and future agreements. The language was sterile but unmistakable. "We cannot in good conscience continue our affiliation with an institution whose leadership reflects values inconsistent with our own." Overnight, what had been a sprawling ecosystem of influence shrank into a silo of isolation. Revenue streams evaporated. PR lines flooded with reporters demanding statements. Anonymous employees began sharing internal memos, revealing years of misconduct swept under corporate rugs. Internal Slack screenshots were posted across tech forums. An internal HR survey titled Workplace Inclusion Metrics, which Jonathan had once bragged about to investors, was leaked, showing dismal results and unaddressed complaints. At one point, the office security team had to escort an angry former employee off the property after she stood outside the main doors with a handmade sign that read, "You fired the wrong people." Jonathan spent his final hours inside the building packing what little he could into a brown banker's box, his nameplate, a family photo, an engraved pen from his early days. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had once told the junior manager during layoffs to carry yourself out with dignity. And now here he was, head down, trying to leave unnoticed. But it was too late for dignity. As he exited through the private elevator, a camera flash went off across the street. A reporter shouted his name. "Mr. Blake, is it true you once said you'd rather lose a contract than respect a black investor?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. His world had gone silent. In a nearby tower, Malcolm Reed stood by the window of his downtown office, watching Calder's building fade into a shrinking silhouette against the skyline. Weeks passed. The media firestorm that had consumed Calder and Knox eventually began to subside, though the damage it left behind remained etched in the company's structure like burn marks on a foundation. What had once been a symbol of elite innovation now served as a case study in business schools across the country, not for its products or market moves, but for its downfall driven by ego, bias, and unchecked power. Jonathan Blake had vanished from the public eye. No interviews. No statements. He'd retreated to a small cottage outside of Boston, disconnected from the world he once ruled, forced to sit with the consequences of everything he lost, not just his title, his wealth, or his influence, but the illusion that he had ever been untouchable. The silence was his only companion, and for the first time in years, he listened. He replayed every word he had said to Malcolm, every moment he dismissed, minimized, mocked. It came to him not all at once, but slowly, like dawn creeping across a frostbitten landscape. And when the guilt became unbearable, he did something no one expected. He picked up a pen. Jonathan wrote by hand, not because it was poetic, but because typing felt too impersonal. He didn't email, didn't go through lawyers. He wrote a real letter, on real paper, with real emotion. He admitted his arrogance. He acknowledged the way he had let his prejudice masquerade as professionalism. He wrote the words no CEO ever liked to admit. I was wrong. Not just about you, but about myself. I was blinded by the idea that power belonged to a certain image. I couldn't see past my own reflection, and by the time I did, everything around me was broken. He ended the letter with a simple truth. If I ever have the chance to do something that matters again, I hope it's because I've finally learned to listen before I lead. The letter arrived at Malcolm Reed's office quietly, in a plain envelope, unsigned on the outside. When his assistant brought it in, Malcolm was in the middle of a meeting with the founding members of a new philanthropic initiative. He read it in silence, his expression unchanged, and then he folded it once neatly and placed it in the drawer beside his desk. He didn't show it to anyone. He didn't announce it. Instead, he finished the meeting, thanked his guests, and looked out the window for a long time afterward. Later that week, Malcolm stood at a podium in front of a packed auditorium. It was the launch event for the Echelon Fund, a nonprofit organization dedicated to identifying, training, and promoting young professionals from underrepresented backgrounds into leadership roles. The fund was backed by Reed Capital, staffed by some of the brightest minds across industries, and already partnered with 3 major Fortune 500 companies. But it wasn't just a business move. It was personal. Malcolm addressed the room. This fund isn't about revenge. It's about restoration, he said. We don't rise by tearing others down. We rise by making space for voices that have been ignored, for talents that have been overlooked, and yes, even for those who've made mistakes but want to be better. That last line made a few heads tilt in curiosity. What they didn't know, at least not yet, was that Malcolm had quietly extended a private offer to Jonathan Blake. Not a position of power, not a title, but a chance. A role in the background, far from cameras or praise, working on bias training modules and inclusion frameworks as part of the fund's ethics division. He didn't owe Jonathan forgiveness, but he believed in accountability with purpose. And Jonathan, now humbled, had accepted. No fanfare, no press release, just a man trying to fix what he had helped break. Over the following months, the program flourished. Dozens of young leaders emerged from its mentorship arms, and Malcolm made it a point to attend every graduation, shake every hand, and remind every person that success didn't require fitting someone else's mold. Jonathan, true to his word, stayed behind the scenes. He worked long hours, read more than he spoke, and never once asked for credit. Sometimes, when asked why he was there, he simply answered, to unlearn. And Malcolm? He didn't dwell in the past. He built forward, not just companies, not just capital, but something much rarer, a path for healing. Not by forgetting what had happened, but by ensuring that what happened would never be repeated. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe to support more powerful narratives like this one. What part of the story hit you the hardest? Do you believe in second chances for people like Jonathan? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.